Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 54, Life in Medieval Bulgaria. Thank you to new State Councillor Greg, and thanks once again to everyone subscribing on any platform. For any of you who use Supercast, you can now subscribe to members' episodes at rehpsupercast.com. We left Volga, Bulgaria, as it converted to Islam and was well into the process of transitioning to a sedentary society based around large cities in the Volga region. The Bulgars have not appeared in our story much since then, but that is about to change. Unlike the Rus, we have no birch bark letters for insight into the world of ordinary Bulgars. In fact, the only written records we have are a handful of inscriptions on graves. We don't have any surviving Bulgar cities either, for the same reason that the written records were lost. The Mongols razed their cities to the ground and prohibited rebuilding. But thanks to their adoption of Islam, we have reports from Muslim travelers and scholars, and we have extensive archaeological remains that give us an idea of how they lived. Let's start by looking at what we know about those cities. Archaeologists have found the remains of more than 170 towns and cities across the territory of Volga, Bulgaria, which, if you'll recall from our previous episodes, was larger than the modern Tatarstan and extended further to the south and east. For comparison, as mentioned a couple of episodes ago, the Kiev lands had around 80 towns surrounding Kiev, while Susdalia, rapidly becoming the most powerful knyazhestvo, had just 20. So we are talking about a thriving and well-developed region. As we've already mentioned, it was in many ways a kind of steppe parallel to Rus. The sedentarizing nomadic warriors had much in common culturally with the Scandinavian adventurers of Rus. Like the Rus, their development was driven by the access to trade that their position on river routes connected to great empires gave them. Like the Rus, the Bulgars chose to convert to the religion of their most important trading partner, which also gave them a connection to the knowledge of the post-classical world. Like the Rus with Byzantium, we can tell that the Bulgars took advantage of the material skills and know-how of the Samanids of Central Asia, who, as members will have heard, were regarded by contemporary Muslims as the most prosperous and advanced part of the Islamic world. As far as we can tell, the Rus did not care too much for the other part of the classical heritage, literature, rhetoric, the arts. We don't know what the Bulgars' attitude was. They had writers, poets, and historians, but their work was entirely destroyed by the Mongols, and we know of them only from descriptions by foreign authors. Structurally, Bulgarian urban development was much like other parts of Europe. Small settlements grew into fortified centres with administrative, military, cultural, and commercial functions. Around them, villages developed to supply the towns with food and labour, and certain towns developed into regional capitals. You'll remember that Kiev at this time was one of the largest cities in Europe, and the Bulgarian capital, Bilar, which the Rus chronicles call the Great City, was maybe even bigger. The excavated site has a fortified territory of 620 hectares, with another 180 hectares of suburbs outside the city wall. For comparison, 12th century London covered less than 300 hectares and had a population of 30,000. The remains of other large cities have also been found. Some have been matched with names. Suvar, the capital of the region settled by one of the original tribes in the Confederation that migrated to the Volga. By the 11th century, it had come under control of the Bulgars. The city the Rus called Brahimov and Muslim writers called Bulgar, built on the Volga in the early 12th century to become the region's biggest trade center. Alabuga, where the remains of a Byzantine-style castle built under the influence of Khazar fortresses have survived, and Murom, a major site of 400 hectares that was probably the administrative center of the southern part of Bulgaria. This is a different Murom to the Rus Murom that has been mentioned. There are several Muroms. The other sites are mostly known by the Russian names of modern villages near where they were discovered, and their Bulgarian names have been lost. Much of this archaeological work was carried out thanks to Soviet dam building. A series of massive dams along the Volga and the Kama flooded vast tracts of land to create reservoirs used to power hydroelectric stations, including the Volga hydroelectric station at Volgograd, the biggest in the world when it was built, and to make the river navigable for modern freight shipping. Archaeologists had some opportunities to examine the sites that were uncovered during construction works, but not as much as they would have liked, of course. These sites added to finds made since the late 19th century, many by Tatar scholars trying to rediscover their past. A couple of major sites have also been found in what is now Perm Oblast, showing that the Bulgars had extended their control of trade along the Kama. Kazan, the modern capital of Tatarstan, only became an important city after the Mongol conquest, and was initially a fortress guarding the Bulgars' northeastern border against the Rus. As we have covered in the previous episodes, the Bulgars had already become semi-settled while they were in the south, forming a large part of the Saltiv culture. In Bulgaria, which was right on the forest-steppe border, and not suitable for a nomadic lifestyle, they fully transitioned into settled agriculture by the 10th century. By this point, we have finds of graveyards with thousands of burials, showing a well-established stationary population. Ibn Fadlan and Ibn Rusta note that the Bulgars were an agrarian nation. The tale of bygone years mentions the Rus obtaining grain from the Bulgars during times of famine, which also implies that the Bulgars had stable production that generated a surplus available for export. The foundation of Bila, Bulgar, and Suvar can also be dated to the 10th century, supporting the theory of a rapid transition from a mixed steppe culture to a sedentary agricultural one. There has been a fair amount of scholarly debate as to the extent to which the early major cities of Bulgaria represented tribal centers. It is possible that there was an ethnic element to their development. The Mali-Cheremshan basin, where Bila was situated, is referred to by contemporary writers as the home of the Bulgars, while Suvar, of course, gets its name from the Suvars. However, Other scholars argue that tribal identities had already disappeared by the time that Bulgaria was settled. From their position, the Bulgars, Suvars, Bursila, Esagels, and other groups mentioned are not tribes in the traditional understanding, that is, groups based on kinship, but a transitional identity between steppe tribes and a national consciousness. Rather than kinship, this identity was based on territory. If you were from Suvar, you were a Suvar. Following this line, the major cities and the territory that they controlled should be treated as a kind of principality. Interestingly, to me at least, the major cities of Bulgaria appear to have been newly founded. Bila likely by decree of the emir for the purpose of becoming the capital. Only some of the smaller towns show any evidence of being inhabited before the Bulgars arrived in the region. Bila was situated on the Mali-Chiremshan River, around 150 kilometers from Kazan, 50 kilometers from the Kama River, 100 kilometers to Bulgar, which was on the Volga, and 75 kilometers from Suvar. It comprises a central citadel, a surrounding walled city, and the outer suburbs. The population could have reached as much as 100,000, a very large city by medieval European standards. It is first mentioned in the tale in 1164, when Andrei Bogolyubsky campaigns against Bulgaria and the survivors of the Bulgar army are described as fleeing to the great city. The final mention comes in 1236, recording the destruction of the city by the Mongols. Bila seems to have been established within the boundaries of the circular city wall right from the beginning, with important administrative buildings in the center, and then filled in the territory with buildings over time. This is characteristic of a number of cities founded by sedentarizing steppe cultures. The stone mosque and brick buildings in the center, which we've already mentioned, were the first of their kind built in Eastern Europe, predating the first brick buildings in Rus. Around them were important artisan districts, metallurgists, potters, and other craftspeople. Merchants were also an important part of the population. Scales, weights, and other trade-related items have been found in large numbers across the site. The last half a century of Bila's existence was the zenith of Volga, Bulgaria. Housing within the city walls more than doubled, and the walls and other fortifications were entirely rebuilt and extended. The great square next to the central mosque, identified as a marketplace by visiting writers, was almost entirely built over. Brick-built houses with hypercaust heating systems, usually two-storied, became the norm for rich merchants and officials, as well as the emir. Their servants lived in log buildings nearby. You might ask why such a large and well-developed city is not better known, and this is a question that scholars have considered. There does not seem to be any better explanation than remoteness. Most of the Islamic descriptions of Bulgaria are from the early 10th century, when Ibn Fadlan and others travelled and the official conversion to Islam was progressing. In these works, Bila and Suvar are referred to as cities with mosques and a population of 10,000 men. By the end of the 10th century, Bila is described as having an army of 20,000 horsemen. There is some confusion in the texts over the location of the cities, indicating that they are based on reports that have been passed along. By the 12th century, al-Jawaliki, who claimed to have visited Bulgaria, described Bila as, quote, a city inhabited by Christians and Muslims, the latter having a large mosque. Their buildings are similar to the buildings of Rum, that is, Byzantium. They are a great people. Their city is called Bulgar. It is a very big city. End quote. The 13th century Persian historian Juvayni described Bulgaria at the time of the Mongol conquest. Quote, within the Bulgar limits, the princes have united. First, the Mongols took them by force and stormed the great city of Volga, which was famous in the world for the inaccessibility of the locality and the large population. End quote. Bila is known as Bulgar in the Muslim texts. Western travelers did not write descriptions of the region until after the Mongol conquest. Suva is mentioned less frequently than Bila and not by eyewitness visitors. However, coins were minted in Suva by two emirs, Talib ibn Ahmed and Mumin ibn Ahmed, who ruled in the mid-10th century. There are no known references to any later rulers of Suva, which suggests that it was originally independent and was then taken over by the Bulgar emir. The site of Suva was discovered in the 19th century and has been well excavated. Not a single item among the thousands found can be dated to after the Mongol conquest, showing that the city was destroyed suddenly and catastrophically. Murom, the southern Bulgar city, is also notable to the discovery of a brick kiln there, the first in Eastern Europe. Fired bricks are far superior to sun-dried bricks in terms of strength, durability, and waterproofness. The first brick buildings built in both Bulgar and Rus used sun-dried bricks, but the Bulgars were using kiln-fired bricks well before the Rus, probably thanks to artisans from Central Asia. Stone and brick buildings have been found across the territory of Bulgaria at Bila, Alabura, Suva, Kulash, Krasnaya Sandjukova, and Murom. Usually they were mosques, fortifications, and some that appear to have been residences of the emir. For the rest of the population, early visitors described the cities of Bulgar as being built of pine and oak, with many of the townspeople living in yurts. But these were not tent cities. It seems that the Bulgars' actual practice was to live in their houses in the winter and then in a yurt next to the house in the summer. Traces of permanent wooden posts for the yurts have been found next to buildings. The buildings were quite varied. There are semi-dugout houses, log huts, and timber-framed wattle and daub buildings. The log houses had a gabled roof, while the wattle and daub ones were flat-roofed. Mostly they are square, some rectangular or oval. They have plank floors on beams and food storage places underneath. When the pits were dug, fire was used to bake the walls hard. The houses have open hearths and tandoor-style fireplaces. The yurts were also erected over pits, but only shallow ones. They did not have internal hearths. It seems that the cooking was done outdoors in the summer. This part of Russia is warm in the summer. A fire would not have been needed for heating. Archaeologists see these buildings as evidence of the Bulgars adapting to their new environment. The timber frame wattle and daub buildings are characteristic of Saltiv settlements in the south and other remains from the Khazars. This is quite natural as forest was minimal in the south, so building techniques that limited wood usage would have been necessary, and the winters were also less harsh. In contrast, Bulgaria lay within reach of the forests. Ample timber was available, and the winters were colder with more snowfall. The log houses therefore became the prevailing building type. In the later phase of development, two-room houses became common. They were rectangular, with a dividing wall between the room with the cooking area and access to underground storage, and what must have been the main living area. Most of the artifacts found by archaeologists come from this type of building, which would have been the home of more affluent residents. The central part of Bilar was paved with stone, and it appears that other parts of the town laid gravel and wood roads. Outside of the cities, the Bulgars lived in fortified and unfortified villages and fortresses. Over 70 sites have been examined between the Mali Cheremshan and the Sheshma, the area surrounding Bilar. Several are major fortresses with multiple rings of ramparts and outlying suburbs. There is some evidence that certain towns specialized in a particular craft. A settlement at Lyasheva had a high concentration of iron and blacksmithing works. Bulgarian metalwork was highly regarded in the Muslim world, with several writers referring to weapons and chainmail as Bulgarian exports. Metalwork-related remains are found across the territory of Bulgaria at a noticeably higher density than in Rus. Bilar, of course, had its own works, with a large iron smelter and forging furnaces. Murom was another metalworking centre that also produced copper and bronze. The smelters were of the bloomery type, used everywhere before the development of blast furnaces. They produce a mix of iron and slag called a bloom. These can be quite large. Stacks of blooms stored ready to be worked into wrought iron have been found at Starokuybyshev that are around 10 meters by 5 meters and 40 centimeters thick. In the period immediately preceding the Mongol invasion, metalwork in Bulgaria was also booming. We see blacksmithing splitting away from the actual production of metal itself. There is a dramatic increase in the number and types of blacksmithing tools and a proliferation of iron agricultural tools, weapons, locks, and other implements. There are clear signs of a move towards standardization, which implies deeper specialization and the beginnings of formal training. Blacksmiths in different areas move towards specialization, especially in the cities, which increased skill, productivity, and quality. The blacksmiths of Bilar, in particular, start producing work that is noticeably better than what we find in other towns. Similar developments can be traced in non-ferrous metals, which were widely used in domestic goods, jewelry, and to decorate other items, such as swords. Silver and gold items became an important trade good. The remains of glass manufacturing have been found across the territory of Bulgaria. Various techniques of casting, blowing, and polishing were used. The quartz sand found along the Kama contains iron and titanium impurities that are detrimental to glass and require production at higher temperatures. The Bulgars discovered how to do this, which results in strong, high-quality glass with very low chemical reactivity. The brick houses of Bulgarian cities had glazed windows. Circular panes of window glass were made by spinning the hot glass into a disc 3 to 8 millimeters thick. But unlike the Rus, Bulgars did not use glass beads as jewellery. Quantities of beads have only been found at border trade centres, where they would have been used as a medium of exchange. Ceramics were well developed in Bulgaria, which should be expected, as the Bulgars would have had plenty of opportunity to obtain sophisticated ceramic knowledge from the Byzantines and Khazars while living in the south. They brought ceramic styles that reflected this with them to the Volga, and the influx of Khazar migrants after the collapse of Khazaria brought more. As with metalworking, specialized centers of production appeared, with a particularly important one in a suburb southwest of Bila. Large brick-built kilns were used to fire the ceramics. Several different types of potter's wheel have been found, and bone tools were used to incise designs. The pattern of comma-shaped incisions was particularly characteristic. Zoomorphic designs were common. Finds include stoppers and salt cellars in the form of ducks, horse heads, goats, sheep, cockerels, and mugs with bear handles. Stylized animals were drawn or incised on other items. Other common decorations included family tamgas and written messages, names, blessings, or simply the word Allah, written in Turkic runes or in Arabic. The Bila settlement shows clear signs of specialization and standardization, with workshops arranged in a line along the river from the potters down to the kilns, and facilities large enough for mass production. Brick production was probably related to this ceramics production, at least initially, but became separate as the scale of brick construction increased. Dozens of brick buildings have been discovered in Bila alone. Brick kilns have been found in Bila and Murom, but bricks were likely produced in other towns as well, given the number of brick buildings. The standard bricks were almost square, 25 by 24 centimeters, and 5 centimeters thick. The brick kilns are similar to those found in Crimea and Central Asia, and were probably first introduced by foreign artisans, like brickwork itself. Over the period from the 10th century through to the Mongol invasion, even small settlements follow the same kind of pathway as the big cities. Houses improve in size and quality. The number of artifacts increases with wealth. Small towns and villages build bigger and better fortifications. The fortified settlements form a network surrounding the cities, protecting the farmland lying in between them. These farms were worked by extended families. There is a high concentration of small settlements for around 20 to 30 people throughout the area between the cities and the fortified settlements. Usually there is a main living building and a courtyard with outbuildings. Similar settlements are found at the edges of main populated areas, where they mostly engaged in hunting, fishing, beekeeping, and trapping. The density of settlement around Bila suggests that the whole of the countryside was being used for either arable farming or animal husbandry. Farmers grew a wide range of grain: wheat, barley, millet, rye, spelt, and oats, as well as peas, lentil, flax, and hemp. As well as the references to famine relief, both the Tale and Muslim writers refer to the neighbouring populations travelling to Bulgaria to buy grain. The Bulgars had wooden ploughs, which were usually pulled by horses, and used a two-field crop rotation method. According to an article on Bulgar animal husbandry by archaeologist and biologist Ida Petrenko, even though the Bulgars had already been in the western steppe for several centuries at this point, the Bulgars' horses were still the same type of indigenous horses from the eastern steppe, rather than the more modern breeds. They were short, most of the bone remains found showing them being under 13 hands. They had medium-sized heads that were a different shape to those of the forest zone horses the Rus rode, and had well-developed jaws for eating fibrous plants. They had shorter legs with large, strong hooves that were well adapted for foraging in the snow. These steppe pony-type horses are notable for their agility and very high endurance. Over time, examples of Central Asian horse breeds, taller and faster, begin to appear, most likely prestige animals owned by the elite. The evidence suggests that the Bulgars ate their steppe ponies, but they did not eat these expensive imports. But horse meat was not a large part of their diet. It seems that fish was their main source of protein. The rivers at this time still teemed with large sturgeon. For meat, sheep and cattle were the main source. The Bulgars kept a large sheep breed that is not found anywhere else. Cows, on the other hand, were small, around 105 centimeters at the withers, and short-horned. They are very similar to the cattle that the Rus kept. Pig bones are found in small quantities in the large cities and were likely raised and eaten by the Rus artisans living there. Camel bones are found everywhere. Some may have been eaten, but it does not seem that they were raised for meat. Rather, they would have been used for transportation. The Finno-Ugrian peoples that the Bulgars traded with to the north and east and gradually brought under their control typically used traps and snares for hunting, but it seems that the Bulgars, maybe due to their steppe heritage, frowned on this and hunted on horseback, running down their prey with dogs and birds of prey. Their trained birds were highly valued and were exported to Central Asia. We have very little information on religion in Bulgaria. From the comments of Ibn Fadlan and other early visitors, we know that Islam was already widely practiced even before their official conversion. Once the official conversion was decided, it seems to have rapidly displaced any other beliefs. All the cities have large central mosques, usually the first stone or brick building to be built. In common with other Islamic states at the time, the name of the ruler and various official announcements were given during the khutbah, the sermon preached at the main Friday meeting and on festival days, giving the mosques an important place in state administration. From Ibn Fadlan, we know that he found a number of beliefs and practices in Bulgaria to be unorthodox, and took it upon himself to educate them in the correct Islamic ways. You would have to expect that a people on the very edge of the Muslim world, outside the area of Arab conquest, with a different cultural heritage, would be different in their practices. But this is another area where the Mongol destruction means we can only guess at any indigenous characteristics of Bulgar Islam. We are now approaching the emergence of Russia and the beginnings of its imperial expansion. The traditional historiography has mostly followed a narrative in which Russia is more advanced and civilized and the steppe is backwards and primitive. In this narrative, Russia's expansion east and south is an inevitable civilizing mission in which the influence flows only one way. Even opponents of Russian imperialism sometimes fall into this way of thinking. In his series of lectures on the history of Ukraine, available on YouTube, Timothy Snyder claims that there was no city or cultural center of any significance east of Kiev and Chernihiv. I think that you will agree that, despite our problems with sources, we know enough about Bulgaria to see that that was not true. This was a well-developed kingdom with cities comparable to Kiev or Chernihiv, and with more advanced metalwork and construction. It was at least as literate as Rus, and the tale seems to suggest that its agriculture was more productive. Next episode, we will look at Bulgaria's international relations, which are likewise just as well developed as Rus, and how its rivalry with the emerging power of Susdalia leads to wars between them. We should not be thinking in terms of a more advanced European power against a less developed Asian-influenced steppe culture. The Bulgars were, at the very least, the equals of Rus, a thriving and growing regional power. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.